The galactic networks exploded with activity over the following days, and what started as a trickle of information from the horizon became a flood, as other human ships and outposts and regular civilians began sharing their own stories, and the Council's Communication Oversight Committee tried to contain the spread, but they were trying to hold back an ocean with their bare hands on the orbital station above Pellar 4, which was a mining colony on the edge of Council space. A young woman, named Amy Richardson, sat in her small apartment watching the coverage of the hearing, and she had been following the story since it broke and felt helpless and angry at how humanity was being shown. Because the Vraxian edited footage made her people look like monsters when her own experience told a completely different story. Amy worked as a cultural liaison between the human mining operation and the native Pellaran species, who were methane-breathing beings that lived in the planet's deep caves, and she had spent 5 years learning their language and their customs and building trust between the two communities. And when she saw Commander Brooks's call for real stories to counter the propaganda, she made a decision. She recorded a video message and said her name was Amy Richardson, and she had lived on Pellar 4 for 5 years, and the Pellarans were listed in Council databases as a hostile species that refused contact with outsiders, but that was not the truth. And they were not hostile but cautious because the first aliens they met tried to strip mine their sacred sites without permission. She continued and described how the human colony had approached the Pellarans with respect and how they had negotiated fair mineral rights and how they had helped the Pellarans upgrade their old filtration systems to improve air quality in their caves. She said last year when a cave collapse trapped 30 Pellarans underground, it was human rescue teams who worked for 48 hours straight to free them. And it was human medical staff who treated the injured, and the Pellaran elder told her that humans were the first outsiders who treated them as equals and not as primitives or obstacles. She uploaded the video to the same networks that were carrying the Horizon footage, and within hours, her message was viewed by millions. And she was not alone. Across the galaxy, humans who had been quietly doing their jobs and building relationships and living their lives began to speak up. And a human doctor working in a refugee camp for displaced Etherians recorded a testimonial. And a human engineer who had helped rebuild infrastructure on a war-torn world added his voice. And a human teacher at a multi-species academy shared stories of students from many races learning together. The testimonials came from civilians and military people, and from scientists and merchants, and from explorers and diplomats, and each one added another piece to the picture of human activity in the galaxy, and a picture far more complex than the Vraxian narrative allowed. On the Council station, Daniel Harper watched the growing movement with a mixture of hope and worry. And the strategy was working, but it was also provocative, and the more humans spoke out, the more the Council hardliners and particularly the Vraxian faction pushed back. Lisa reported that they were calling it a coordinated disinformation campaign, and Vexthon had demanded that all human communications be suspended pending investigation, and he was claiming they were violating information warfare protocols. Daniel asked if any Council members were believing it, and Lisa said some were, but others were starting to ask uncomfortable questions, and the Chitara delegation formally requested that the hearing be expanded to include testimony from non-human species who had interacted with humans, and the trader guilds submitted a petition signed by over 3,000 member organizations praising human commercial practices. Jake Peterson entered the room with excitement clear on his face, and he said, Daniel needed to see this, and it was from the Pelios homeworld. He turned on a holographic display showing a massive gathering on the Pelios capital, and thousands of the water beings had assembled in their central plaza, which was a location usually reserved for only the most important cultural events. The Pelios elder who had declared humanity friends of the deep spoke to the crowd and to the cameras broadcasting the event across the galaxy. The elder said they had heard the accusations against humanity, and they had heard them called warmongers and aggressors, but they who had swum beside humans, and who had been saved by them, and who had learned from them knew the truth. And when their world was dying and when their people were drowning in their own homes, it was not the Galactic Council who came to help, and it was not the Vraxian Empire that shared their technology to save their children, and it was humanity. The elder raised his webbed hand in a gesture of solidarity and said, The council may judge humans with their laws and procedures, but the Peleos judged them by their actions, and by that measure humanity had proven themselves worthy of the stars. The crowd erupted in their species form of applause, which was a rhythmic thrumming that resonated through the water and the air above. The footage went viral. Similar demonstrations began occurring across the frontier regions and species that had benefited from human assistance and that had formed friendships with human explorers, and that had seen firsthand the difference between the propaganda and the reality began to speak out. The Wanderer clans, whose generation ships had been repaired by the Horizon crew, sent a delegation to the council station, and they appeared before the council speaker and requested the right to testify on humanity's behalf. Their representative, who was a being named Drift on Solar Wind, stated that they were not council members, and they had no political agenda, but they had traveled the void for 10,000 years, and they had met many species, and some were kind, and some were cruel, and most were indifferent, and humanity was the first species in living memory who helped them without asking for anything in return. And they repaired their ships and shared their supplies and learned their songs. And if this was what the council feared, then perhaps the council had forgotten what it meant to be civilized. The statement was broadcast across every major network, and the tide of public opinion was shifting, and the council leadership could feel it. In the council chamber, the hearing that was supposed to be a quick formality had turned into a sprawling debate that stretched across multiple sessions, and representatives who had been prepared to approve the Vraxian recommendations were now hesitating because they were aware that their constituents were paying attention. High Chancellor Vexthon grew increasingly agitated, and his carefully built case was crumbling, and he called for closed-door sessions and argued that the public attention was stopping the council's ability to make an objective decision. But Ambassador Martinez, sensing the momentum shifting, pushed back hard. She argued before the full assembly that the council had spent weeks exposing humanity's actions to public scrutiny, and they had broadcast their failures, both real and imagined, across the entire galaxy. And now they wished to hide behind closed doors when evidence emerged that contradicted their narrative, and if humanity was to be judged publicly, then let that judgment be informed by the full truth, and not selected propaganda. The Graven representative Stone Voice considered her words carefully, and the Graven were known for their patience and their commitment to procedural fairness, even when it was inconvenient. He rumbled that the human representative raised a valid concern, and this body had set a precedent by conducting these proceedings in full view of the galactic community, and to retreat into privacy now would appear selective. The vote was called, and by a narrow margin, the council agreed to continue the public hearings and to allow testimony from non-council species who had interacted with humanity. Vexthon's scales darkened to nearly black, which was a Vraxian expression of rage barely contained. Over the next week, a parade of witnesses appeared before the council, and some spoke in person, and others via holographic projection. And they came from many species and hundreds of worlds, and they spoke of human doctors who had fought diseases, and human engineers who had built infrastructure, and human scientists who had shared discoveries, and human merchants who had traded fairly, and human explorers who had ventured into danger to rescue the stranded and the lost. Not every testimony was positive, and some species reported difficult interactions and cultural misunderstandings and conflicts, but even these more critical witnesses acknowledged that humanity had generally attempted to resolve disputes peacefully and had shown a willingness to learn from mistakes. The effect was undeniable, and humanity was not the one-dimensional threat the Vraxians had portrayed, and they were complex and flawed, but ultimately well-meaning participants in the galactic community. One of the most powerful moments came when a young Chitara student appeared before the council, and her name was Shimmerweave, and she attended the same multi-species academy where a human teacher had shared testimony earlier. She explained that she was studying to be a xenosociologist, and her thesis was on how new species integrated into established galactic society, and she had studied the historical records of every species admitted to the council over the past 5,000 years, and she asked if they knew what she found. She turned on a holographic display showing comparative data. She said every single species faced resistance during their integration period, and every single species was accused of being too aggressive or Commander Helen Brooks had been in deep space for 3 years, and she was far from Earth, and even farther from the political games of the Galactic Council, and her survey ship Horizon was small compared to military ships, but it was fast and well equipped and had some of the best specialists in the fleet, and when the encrypted message from Captain Harper arrived, she knew immediately that everything was about to change. She read the code on her private screen, and it said, Protocol 17, and she said the words out loud, and around her on the bridge her officers were doing their jobs and did not know that a storm was coming. Lieutenant Ben Morris, who was her communications officer, looked up from his station, and Helen stood up and told him to pull every piece of footage they had collected over the past 3 years, and that meant every first contact, and every diplomatic mission, and every interaction they had with species that were not in the Council. Ben's eyebrows went up, and he said that was going to be hundreds of hours of video, and Helen said she knew, and she told him to get Lieutenant Karen Walsh from the archive section to help him, and she wanted everything ready to send out within 6 hours. Ben asked if they would send it through official channels, and Helen smiled, but it was not a happy smile, and she said no. And they would use every unofficial channel they could find, and that meant independent news networks and schools and trading companies and anyone who would listen. Ben stopped for a moment, and he said that was going to get them in serious trouble with Command. But Helen said Command was not their worry right now, and she pressed a button that opened a channel to the whole ship and told everyone to get ready for a priority briefing in 15 minutes. In the eating area, she gathered her crew, and there were 53 men and women who had trusted her to lead them through unknown parts of space, and they deserved to know what she was asking them to risk. She started by saying that most of them had heard rumors about humanity's status in the Galactic Council, and those rumors were true, and the Council was holding a hearing to decide if humanity should be locked into their own solar system, and stopped from being part of the galaxy. People in the room started talking to each other, and Helen raised her hand for quiet, and she said the Vraxians had shown evidence that made humans look like warmongers, and they had edited videos and taken things out of context and convinced other species that humanity was dangerous. She pointed to the big screen, and the first of their videos started playing, and it showed the Horizon making contact with the Peleos, who were water creatures that had been alone in their system for thousands of years after a disease destroyed their ability to travel in space. The crew watched as the video showed human doctors working with Peleos healers and sharing technology and medical knowledge, and they saw Helen herself walking through water up to her chest to help move Peleos children away from a flooding home. And they saw tears on alien faces, and saw the moment when the Peleos elder said that humanity was a friend of the deep. Helen said this was what they had been doing out here, and not conquering and not destroying, but building bridges and making friends and saving lives. And the Council did not want anyone to see it, because it proved that everything the Vraxians said about humans was wrong. She stopped talking and let her words sink in, and then she said she had received orders from Captain Harper to activate Protocol 17, and that meant sending this footage through unofficial channels and going around Council control. And it meant they were going to flood the galactic network with the truth, but she needed them to understand what they were risking, because this could end their careers, and they could face military punishment, and the Council might use this as proof that humans should be punished even more. Petty Officer Nathan Cross, who was a veteran of old wars, stood up and said with respect that if they did not do this, then there would not be any careers left to protect, and the Council was trying to cage humans like animals, and he said they should show everyone who humans really were. Around the room, people nodded, and one by one, the crew members said they supported the plan, and Helen felt proud of them. She told them to get to work, and Ben and Karen would work on putting the videos together, and she wanted stories that showed the range of human behavior and their compassion and their innovation, and their willingness to help even when there was nothing to gain. And Nathan would coordinate with their contacts in the independent news networks and use every back channel they had developed. Karen asked about the Council monitoring stations because they would detect large amounts of data being sent, and Helen said they would make sure the data went out in small packets through many relay points, and by the time the Council figured out what was happening, it would be too late to stop it. The crew went to their stations full of energy and purpose, and Helen went back to the bridge and opened a secure channel to her most trusted contact in independent media. And this was a Chitara journalist named Clickweaver who had covered several of their missions. The insect face appeared on the screen and compound eyes glittered with interest. And Clickweaver asked if Helen knew that her species was currently facing council sanctions. Helen said she was aware, and she had something that might interest a good journalist, and she asked how Clickweaver would like an exclusive look at humanity's real activities in the frontier regions and hundreds of hours of unedited footage showing first contact missions. Clickweaver's antenna moved, which Helen had learned meant intense interest, and the alien said the council would not authorize such a release. Helen said the council did not authorize it, and this was coming directly from humans, and the question was, did Clickweaver want the real story, or did the journalist want to keep repeating Vraxian propaganda? There was a long pause, and then Clickweaver's mandibles clicked in what was the Chitara version of a smile, and the journalist said to send the files and broadcasts would begin within the hour. Over the next 6 hours, the horizon became very busy, and the crew put together footage and wrote explanations and prepared data packets to send, and they showed humanity at its best, and negotiating peace between groups at war, and sharing medical technology, and helping stranded ships, and exploring dangerous areas to gather scientific information that would help all species. One video showed Lieutenant Greg Turner, who was a scientist spending 3 weeks helping an insect species fight a parasite infection that was killing their babies, and the footage showed the moment when the first cured infant was returned to its parent, and the alien's joy was so strong it did not need any translation. Another video showed the Horizon crew working with the nomadic wanderer clans and repairing their generation ships and refusing any payment except the chance to learn about their ancient culture. As the first data packet started sending to relay stations across the sector, Ben looked up from his station and said they were committed now. And the first batch was away. Helen nodded and told him to keep them coming and flood the network far away in the Galactic Council chamber. The Vraxian prosecution was presenting its case, and High Chancellor Vexathon spoke with smooth words, and his holographic evidence showed human warships in battle and human soldiers fighting, and human colonies expanding into space that was being argued over. He said the pattern was clear, and humanity claimed to want peace, but their actions showed they wanted conquest, and they were too young and too aggressive and too dangerous to be trusted with the freedom of the galaxy. Ambassador Lisa Martinez watched and felt frustrated, because every time they tried to provide context, they were stopped by procedural objections, and every piece of evidence they tried to submit was ruled inadmissible because of technical violations of council rules. It was a rigged game, and they were losing. Then during a break, Lisa's datapad started vibrating with incoming messages, and one after another notifications piled up, and she opened the first one and her eyes went wide. It was a news alert from Clickweaver's network, and the headline said exclusive, "The Other Side of Humanity." She opened the article and saw the footage from the horizon and the video of human medics with the Pelios and the story of Greg Turner and the insect children, and testimony from many species praising human help and generosity. Lisa grabbed Daniel's arm and told him to look at this. Daniel read quickly, and his expression changed from surprise to something like hope, and he said Helen actually did it. Lisa asked what he meant, and Daniel said Helen was bypassing the council and taking the truth directly to the people. More notifications arrived, and other news networks were picking up the story, and independent journalists across the galaxy were downloading the footage and broadcasting it, and the story was spreading like wildfire, and the council had no way to stop it. When the hearing started, again there was a different feeling in the chamber, and representatives were checking their own datapads and whispering to each other. And the narrative was shifting. Council Speaker Stonevoice called for order and said there appeared to be significant activity on the galactic networks, and information about humanity was being widely distributed outside of Council. Channel's Vexthon's scales got darker, which was a sign of anger, and he said this was clearly coordinated propaganda by humanity to influence the proceedings, and he moved that the material be declared inadmissible, and that sanctions be immediately imposed for trying to manipulate council deliberations. Captain Daniel Harper stood at the window of the space station and watched the big alien ship coming closer, and the ship was made of crystal and reflected light from faraway stars, and it belonged to the Galactic Council, which was a government of 1,000 different alien races, And Daniel knew this was not a friendly visit but something much worse. And he turned around to look at Ambassador Lisa Martinez, who was reading the message they had received again and again. Lisa looked up at him with worry in her eyes, and she said they were calling it a formal inquiry, but both of them knew what it really was, and it was a trial. And Daniel was 42 years old, and he had seen many things in his life, and he had been there when humans first met aliens, and he had fought in wars and helped make peace deals, and he knew a trap when he saw one. The door opened and Commander Jake Peterson walked in carrying a computer pad, and his face looked serious, and he said they needed to see something important, and the Council had just released their evidence to all the alien races in the galaxy, and it was already spreading everywhere like wildfire. Daniel took the pad and looked at the files, and there were videos of human battles, and reports of people who died, and statements from aliens who had problems with humans, and everything was shown in the worst way possible, and nothing was explained properly, and it made humans look like they only wanted war and violence. Lisa whispered that they were not just trying to stop humans from speaking, but they were trying to erase the truth about who humans really were. And Jake stood up straight and asked what their orders were, and Daniel looked at the young commander, and then at Lisa, and finally back at the alien ship outside, and he had learned in his many years that sometimes the only way to win was to refuse to play a game that was designed to make you lose. He said they would go to the hearing, but they would not go. Quietly, and he told Jake to contact Commander Helen Brooks, who was on a survey ship called Horizon, and tell her to activate Protocol 17. And Lisa's eyes went wide because she knew what that meant, and she started to say something, but Daniel interrupted her. He said it was the only chance they had, and if the Council wanted to judge humanity, then the galaxy deserved to hear the human side of the story, and all of it without any lies or editing. And Jake saluted and left to send the secret message, and Lisa moved closer to Daniel, and her voice was very quiet now. She said Protocol 17 meant going around the Council's official rules, and if the Council found out before they were ready, then they could say humans broke the membership rules, and they would lose everything they had worked for. Daniel said they were going to lose everything anyway if they let the Council control what people heard about humans, and he brought up a star map on the window screen and pointed to many star systems in the outer parts of space, and he said Helen and her crew had been recording first contact missions for 3 years, and they had real footage and real interviews and the truth about what humans had been doing out there, and the Council did not want that truth to get out because it proved everything the Vraxian Empire said about humans was wrong. Lisa asked what would happen if the plan did not work, and Daniel smiled, but there was no happiness in it, and he said then at least they would go down fighting, and that was the human way. 3 hours later, they got on the Council transport ship, and the inside was designed for many different types of aliens and had different gravity and different rooms and different air for different species, and they were taken by Vraxian guards who were tall reptile creatures with scales that looked like oil on water. The lead guard, who said his name was Enforcer Zaxith, looked at them with disgust, and he said they could only speak when someone asked them a direct question, and they had to give all evidence through proper channels, and any breaking of the rules would be seen as disrespect to the Council. Lisa said she understood, even though Daniel could see her jaw was tight with anger, and they were taken to a waiting room which was empty and plain with almost nothing in it, and when the doors closed behind them, Daniel turned on a small privacy device he had hidden in his uniform, and the device was against the rules. But he was not going to take any chances. He said quietly that Helen got the message and she was already starting to send out the files through back channels, and by the time the hearing started tomorrow, their story would be reaching independent news networks across 100 star systems. Lisa said the Council would be very angry, and Daniel said let them be angry because they were not the ones putting an entire species on trial based on lies and propaganda. The hours went by slowly, and they tried to rest because they knew the next day would decide what happened to humanity's future in the galaxy. And Daniel thought about Earth and about the billions of people who had no idea their fate was being decided so far away in a courtroom that was designed to silence them before they could even speak. But being silent had never been something humans were good at. And when morning came on the station's fake day and night cycle, they were taken to the Council chamber, and the room was huge and circular with seats going up in levels for all the different alien species, and in the center was a raised platform where the accused would stand, and above everything were holographic screens that would show evidence to everyone. The chamber was already full of aliens, and Daniel recognized species from many worlds. And there were the Etherians, who were gas creatures in special suits, and the Chitara, who were like insects with many eyes, and the Graven, who were huge and looked like living stone and had been council members for thousands of years. And there at the highest level sat the Vraxian delegation, and their leader, High Chancellor Vexthon, watched everything with a look that seemed like satisfaction. Lisa said quietly that this was really happening, and Daniel said yes, but so was their plan, and he told her to trust Helen and trust the truth. The council speaker, who was a Graven named Stonevoice, called the chamber to order, and his voice was so deep it seemed to shake the room, and it was translated into hundreds of languages at the same time. He said they were gathered to talk about concerns that many species had about the provisional member called humanity, and the charges were serious and included aggression without reason and breaking contact rules and behavior that did not match council values, and humanity would have a chance to respond. But first they would hear the evidence against them. The lights went dark, and the holographic screens came alive with images and videos. Daniel took a deep breath and got ready for the fight of his life. And this fight was not just for himself, and not just for the people in this room, but for every human who had ever looked up at the stars and dreamed of going there. The council wanted to silence humanity, and now it was time to show them that humans knew how to make their voices heard. High Chancellor Vexthon stood alone in his private chambers aboard the council station, and his reflection was distorted in the polished metal walls, and the hearing was not going according to plan, and what should have been a simple matter of containing a troublesome species had turned into a galactic referendum on the Vraxian Empire's credibility. His second-in-command, Commander Silkar, entered without knocking, which was a breach of protocol that showed how serious the situation was. Silkar reported that the latest polling data from the core worlds showed a 15-point shift in favor of humanity over the past week, and the frontier testimonials were dominating the news cycles, and their own information specialists could not counteract the volume of organic support humanity was receiving. Vexthon's claws scraped against the metal desk, and he said it was impossible because they had spent decades building relationships with council members and ensuring their perspective shaped policy, and a handful of frontier primitives could not undo that work in mere days. Silkar said carefully that it was not just the frontier species, and 3 council members who previously supported their position had requested private meetings with the human delegation, and the trader guilds had formally withdrawn their endorsement of quarantine measures, and even some of their traditional allies were suggesting a compromise position. Vexthon hissed the word compromise and said there could be no compromise because humanity represented an existential threat to the established order, and they expanded too quickly and adapted too readily, and refused to acknowledge the superiority of older civilizations. And if they allowed humans unfettered access to the galaxy, they would upset the balance that had maintained peace for millennia. Silkar hesitated before speaking again, and said with respect that perhaps the balance needed to be upset, and the frontier regions had been neglected by the Council for generations, and humanity had filled that vacuum and built relationships with species that the Council abandoned or never contacted in the first place. And maybe they had been short-sighted in their assessment. Vexthon turned on his subordinate with frightening speed and asked if Silkar dared question the Empire's judgment. Silkar replied that he questioned whether this approach served the Empire's long-term interests, and they were losing this fight. And every day that humans spoke freely, they gained more support, and if they continued to push for total quarantine, they might find themselves isolated rather than humanity. The Chancellor was silent for a long moment, and finally he spoke, and his voice was dangerously quiet. He said they would change tactics, and if they could not silence humanity through council procedures, they would give the galaxy a reason to fear them. Silkar asked what he proposed. Vexthon pulled up a star map and highlighted a system on the contested border between council space and the lawless regions beyond, and he said the Kethrak system and a Vraxian merchant convoy was scheduled to pass through there in 2 days, and the area was known for pirate activity. Understanding showed in Silkar's eyes, and he said the Chancellor could not be serious. Vexthon said he was entirely serious, and they would arrange for the convoy to be attacked, and human ships were known to patrol that region, and when the attack occurred, their ships would engage the pirates but would make it appear that human vessels were involved in the coordination, and the evidence would be circumstantial. But compelling Silkar said if this deception was discovered, then everything would be lost. Vexthon interrupted and said it would not be discovered, and they would use Vraxian ships modified to emit signatures similar to human vessels, and they would plant communication intercepts suggesting human involvement, and they would ensure that enough genuine pirate activity occurred to make the scene chaotic and difficult to investigate. And by the time anyone questioned the narrative, the damage to humanity's reputation would be done. Silkar looked troubled but nodded slowly and said he would make the arrangements. Vexthon's voice softened slightly, and he said he understood the concerns, but sometimes to preserve the greater good they must make difficult choices, and the council was stable before humanity arrived, and it would be stable again once they were contained. 2 days later in the Kethrak system, the trap was set. The Vraxian merchant convoy, heavily laden with valuable trade goods, made its way through the asteroid field that marked the system's primary navigation hazard, and unknown to most of the convoy's crew, several of the escort ships were operated by Vraxian intelligence officers loyal to Vexthon. The pirate attack began exactly on schedule. 3 ships bearing the marks of the notorious Kethrak raiders emerged from the asteroid field with weapons firing, and the merchant vessels sent immediate distress signals, while their escorts engaged the attackers. The battle was fierce, but choreographed, and the Vraxian intelligence ships fought convincingly while maneuvering to create sensor readings that would suggest human involvement, and encrypted communications were transmitted on frequencies known to be used by human patrol ships. What Vexthon had not anticipated was that there actually was a human ship in the system. The cargo hauler Nova's Fortune, captained by a civilian named Chris Wagner, was making a routine supply run to a mining outpost when it picked up the distress signal. Chris was a former military officer who had left the service to pursue commercial opportunities, and his ship was unarmed except for basic defense shields, but he knew the region well and had contacts among the local authorities. His co-pilot Emma Price asked if they should respond to the distress call. Chris studied the sensor readings, and something felt wrong about the situation, and the attack pattern was too organized and too precise for typical pirate raiders, and there were strange energy signatures that did not match any known Kethrak ships. He ordered Emma to send a notification to the nearest patrol station and tell them they had a possible staged incident in Kethrak, and then get them closer, but keep their distance, because he wanted full sensor recordings of everything. Emma looked surprised but complied, and the Nova's Fortune changed course and stayed at the edge of sensor range while its advanced civilian detection equipment captured every detail of the battle. As the fight continued, one of the pirate ships broke formation and headed directly toward the Nova's Fortune. Emma said they had been spotted and incoming fire was detected. Chris threw the ship into evasive maneuvers, but the cargo hauler was not built for combat, and energy blasts rocked the hull and alarms blared as shields failed. He ordered Emma to send everything they had recorded to the patrol station and do it. Now Emma's fingers flew across the console and compressed the sensor data and transmitted it in a burst, even as more weapons fire struck their ship. Then unexpectedly the attacking ship broke off. Chris checked his sensors and understood why, because 3 actual human patrol ships had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel and were responding to the distress signals, and the genuine naval vessels immediately moved to engage what they believed were pirate raiders. The situation became chaos, and the Vraxian intelligence ships, faced with real military opposition they had not anticipated, tried to disengage while maintaining their cover story, and the actual Kethrak pirates, seeing an opportunity for easy pickings, launched their own opportunistic attacks. The human patrol ships fought back efficiently and destroyed 2 pirate vessels and forced the others to retreat, and they then moved to assist the damaged Vraxian convoy, and the Nova's Fortune commander, Kyle Sanders, leading the patrol squadron, hailed the Vraxian ships and said this was Human Patrol Group 7, and they had responded to the distress call, and asked what their status was. The Vraxian convoy commander, genuinely unaware of the intelligence operation, responded with obvious relief and said they were damaged but stable, and thanked them for assistance, and the pirates fled when they arrived. Kyle frowned at his sensor readings and said he was showing some unusual energy signatures, and asked if they could explain why some of their escort ships were transmitting on non-standard frequencies. There was a long pause, and then one of the Vraxian intelligence ships, realizing their deception was about to be exposed, made a desperate decision, and it opened fire on the human patrol ships. Kyle ordered all ships to defensive positions and return fire, but disable only because something was very wrong here. The brief but intense engagement ended with the rogue Vraxian ship disabled and drifting, and Kyle ordered a boarding team to secure the vessel and retrieve its computers. What they found would change everything. The ship's communication logs showed transmissions to and from High Chancellor Vexthon's private network, and the weapons had been modified to create sensor signatures mimicking human technology. And the crew, when questioned, reluctantly admitted they were intelligence operatives following orders to stage an incident that would implicate humanity in piracy. And thanks to Chris Wagner's decision to record everything, there was irrefutable proof of the entire operation. Kyle Sanders transmitted his findings directly to the council station and bypassed normal military channels, and he marked the message as urgent and classified. But he also sent encrypted copies to several trusted journalists, including Clickweaver. He had learned from Commander Brooks's example, and sometimes the truth needed to go directly to the people. Within hours, the story broke across the galactic networks. The Vraxian Empire had attempted to frame humanity for an attack on its own convoy. The weeks following the exposure of the Vraxian plot were chaotic for the Galactic Council, and High Chancellor Vexthon was removed from his position and placed under investigation, and several Vraxian delegates resigned or were recalled by their government, and the Empire itself issued a formal apology and claimed that Vexthon had acted without proper authorization, though few believed this was entirely true. But the damage to the campaign against humans was complete and could not be undone. The rebuilt proceedings, now chaired by an impartial panel of 3 judges representing different council factions, humanity was finally given a fair hearing, and Ambassador Lisa Martinez presented Earth's case not as a defense against charges but as a statement of principles and intentions. She told the assembled council that humans did not claim to be perfect, and in their short time among the stars they had made mistakes, and they had approached situations with assumptions rooted in their own culture that did not translate well to others, and they had been aggressive in their exploration and perhaps too eager and too hungry for the unknown, and these were flaws they acknowledged and worked to correct. She gestured to the holographic displays showing footage that had been shared over the past weeks, and humans and aliens working together and celebrating together and solving problems together. She said humans also brought gifts to the galactic community, and they brought energy and innovation, and they brought a perspective shaped by a world that forced them to cooperate across vast differences or die, and they brought hope that the galaxy could be more than a static hierarchy, and that newcomers could contribute rather than simply conform. The Etherian judge, whose species had once been dismissed as too alien for council membership, spoke, and said Ambassador Martinez spoke of contribution. But the concern that lay beneath this entire inquiry was not whether humanity could contribute, but whether humanity would dominate, and human species expanded rapidly and adapted quickly, and showed little respect for established powers. And how did she answer fears that humanity would not simply join the galactic community, but would seek to reshape it according to their own values? Lisa smiled and said she would argue that humans were already reshaping it, just as every new species did, and the Chitara brought their gift for communication networks, and the Graven brought their commitment to long-term thinking, and the Etherians brought new understanding of physics in multiple dimensions, and every species that joined the council changed it, and hopefully for the better. She pulled up a new display showing demographic and cultural data. She said humans made up less than 1% of the council's total population, and even at their current expansion rate, they would not exceed 5% for at least a century, and they were not going to overwhelm the galaxy by sheer numbers, and what they offered was partnership, not dominance, and they wanted to learn from civilizations that had existed for thousands of years, and they wanted to share what they had discovered, and they wanted to be part of the conversation about the galaxy's future. Daniel Harper, watching from his seat, saw several judges nodding thoughtfully. The second judge, who was a Graven named Deepstone, rumbled a question and asked, what of the specific incidents cited in the original charges and the border conflicts and the aggressive expansion into contested territories, and the violations of contact protocols. Lisa did not avoid the question, and she said each incident deserved honest examination, and they welcomed that examination, but context mattered, and the border conflicts were primarily with pirate groups and rogue states. Not legitimate governments, and their expansion into contested territories occurred in regions the Council had declared beyond its jurisdiction. And yes, they violated some contact protocols, usually in situations where those protocols would have prevented them from providing emergency aid. She pulled up specific case files. She said when they made contact with the Kellys before they reached the required technological level, it was because their planet was experiencing ecological collapse, and they needed immediate assistance to survive. And when they established a colony in the disputed Sigma region, it was in coordination with the 3 other species already living there who had been asking the Council for infrastructure support for decades, and they were willing to accept consequences for breaking rules, but they asked that those consequences be proportionate and take into account their intentions. The third judge, who was a synthetic intelligence representing the networked machine consciousnesses, processed her words and asked why they should value the opinions of frontier species who were not Council members, because their perspectives, while interesting, did not carry official weight in deliberations. Lisa's response was sharp but measured, and she said with respect, that question revealed exactly why humanity had found such support in the frontier, and she asked why they should value the opinions of non-member species, and she would argue that any organization that claimed to represent galactic civilization should care about all species, not just those with formal membership, and the beings who testified on humanity's behalf were their neighbors and trading partners and friends, and if the Council did not consider their voices important, then perhaps the Council needed to expand its definition of relevance. There was a stirring in the chamber, and several representatives from younger member species showed visible approval of her statement. The proceedings continued for another week with expert testimony and cultural analyses and detailed examinations of human interactions throughout Council space and beyond, and through it all, humanity's representatives maintained their position that they were newcomers who wanted to contribute, not conquerors seeking to dominate. On the final day of deliberation, Captain Daniel Harper was given the opportunity to make a closing statement. He stood before the Council thinking of all the humans who had contributed to this moment, and Commander Helen Brooks and the crew of the Horizon who had risked their careers to share the truth, and Amy Richardson and countless others who had spoken up from the frontier, and Chris Wagner, whose quick thinking had exposed the Vraxian plot, and civilian diplomats and military officers and scientists and merchants and teachers and explorers who had worked quietly to build bridges between humanity and the galaxy. He began by saying he was a military officer, and he had fought in battles and commanded ships of war, and he understood why some of them saw humanity as a potential threat, and humans were warriors when they needed to be, and they did not apologize for their ability to defend themselves and their allies. He gestured to the viewing ports showing the stars beyond, but he said they were so much more than that, and they were dreamers who looked at the night sky and imagined what might be possible, and they were builders who saw problems as puzzles to solve, and they were storytellers who believed that understanding each other began with listening to each other's tales, and they were stubborn enough to keep trying even when they failed, and humble enough to learn from those failures. His voice carried weight and conviction. He said the Council stood at a crossroads, and they could choose to see humanity as the Vraxians did, and as a threat to be contained, and a problem to be managed and a disruption to their comfortable order. Or they could choose to see humans as they truly were, and as partners in the grand adventure of civilization, and as fellow travelers trying to navigate the complexities of a vast and mysterious universe, and as one more voice adding to the chorus of life among the stars. He paused and let his words fill the chamber. He said humans could not promise they would always do things the way the Council expected, and their perspective was different and shaped by their own unique history. But they could promise that they would always strive to act with honor, and to keep their agreements, and to contribute positively to the galactic community. And they asked not for special treatment, but for fair judgment, and they asked not for dominance, but for partnership, and they asked not to be silenced, but to be heard. Daniel looked directly at each of the 3 judges. He said the Council tried to silence humanity, but The galaxy heard them anyway because the truth was louder than propaganda, and genuine relationships were stronger than political calculations. And now they must decide, and would they reject the future because it did not look like the past, or would they embrace the possibility that newcomers might have something valuable to offer? He returned to his seat and the chamber was silent. The judges retired to deliberate, and the wait was painful, and hours stretched into a full day, and news networks across the galaxy provided constant coverage with experts analyzing every possible outcome. Finally, the judges returned. Council Speaker Stonevoice stood to announce the decision, and his ancient voice carried to every corner of the chamber and across the networks to billions of beings. He said, after careful consideration of all evidence and testimony and arguments presented, this council had reached its decision regarding humanity's status and conduct. The pause seemed endless. He said the charges of systematic aggression and violation of council values were dismissed, and while humanity had at times operated in ways that challenged established protocols, they found that these actions were generally motivated by good faith efforts to address genuine needs and emergencies. Relief washed over the human delegation, but Stonevoice was not finished.